At the United Nations General Assembly, India has delivered one of its strongest global messages against terrorism, declaring that there can never be any justification for terror, regardless of ideology, politics, or strategic interests. Calling on the international community to reject double standards, India urged nations to stop distinguishing between good and bad terrorists, strengthen action against terror financing, and deny safe havens to those who nurture terrorist networks. The statement comes at a time when the global terror ecosystem is rapidly evolving from cross-border proxy networks to cryptocurrency, crowdfunding, and AI-enabled radicalization. Our report.
For a country that has lived through decades of cross-border terrorism, India's message at the United Nations was not merely diplomatic, it was shaped by experience.
India called for adoption of the comprehensive.
From the attacks in Mumbai and Parliament to repeated strikes on civilians, soldiers and pilgrims in Jammu and Kashmir, India has long argued that terrorism cannot be compartmentalized or selectively condemned. Addressing the UN General Assembly during the adoption of the 9th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, India's permanent representative ambassador Parvathaneni Harish reminded the world that terrorism remains the gravest assault on humanity's most basic right, the right to life. And he made India's position unmistakably clear.
India has been a victim of cross-border terrorism for decades. Our people have paid a terrible price, and this experience has shaped India's zero-tolerance approach. Irrespective of any grievance, political cause, or strategic calculation, terrorism in all its forms and manifestations must be condemned unequivocally.
The timing of India's intervention is significant. 20 years after the United Nations adopted its global counter-terrorism strategy, New Delhi says the world still lacks a university-accepted legal definition of terrorism. India has once again pushed for the long-pending Comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism or CCIT, a proposal first introduced by New Delhi in 1996. Successive delays, India argues, have allowed legal loopholes to persist, enabling terrorists, financiers and their sponsors to exploit safe havens while political disagreements stall collective action. India's concerns extend beyond bombs and bullets. The battlefield has shifted online. The Financial Action Task Force has warned that terrorist organizations are increasingly exploiting social media, encrypted messaging platforms, cryptocurrencies, and fraudulent crowdfunding campaigns to raise and move funds across borders. Against that backdrop, India urged countries to strengthen financial intelligence sharing, fully implement FATF standards, and ensure that no jurisdiction becomes a conduit for terror financing. Without naming any country, New Delhi also observed that attempts to undermine FATF's credibility often reflect a fear of scrutiny rather than genuine procedural concerns, a remark widely viewed as an indirect response to Pakistan's repeated criticism of the watchdog. India also questioned the selective approach that often clouds international counter-terrorism efforts. It argued that sanctions must be objective, evidence-based, and free from geopolitical calculations. For New Delhi, defeating terrorism requires political will, not political convenience. The message carried an unmistakable subtext. Countries that continue to differentiate between useful and unacceptable terrorist groups or allow terrorist infrastructure to survive within their territory while speaking the language of peace abroad undermine the very global framework they claim to support.
We can combat the menace of terrorism only if there is no distinction between good or bad terrorists, if sanctions regimes function objectively, and if exclusivist frameworks, new terminologies and false priorities are thwarted and set aside. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, terror anywhere threatens peace everywhere. Mr. President.
As terrorism evolves from physical battlefields to digital networks, India's message from the United Nations is clear. The fight against terror cannot succeed if nations continue to draw political distinctions between perpetrators, tolerate proxy networks, or allow financing channels to remain open. For a country that has spent decades confronting cross-border terrorism, the demand is no longer for stronger words, but for consistent global action. Because in the battlefield against terrorism, India says there can be no good terrorist, no bad terrorist, and no room for double standards.